Over 90% of sitting members of Congress who run for re-election win. That means most Americans don't actually choose their representatives. They ratify the ones already there. And the reason goes back to one room, one summer, and one decision the founders either forgot to make or deliberately avoided. The summer of 1787 was brutal. Philadelphia was sweltering, and inside Independence Hall, 55 men were attempting something that had never been done before, designing a democratic government from scratch, with no real model to follow. They debated almost everything: the structure of Congress, the power of the presidency, the role of the courts. But when it came to how long members of Congress could serve, the debate was surprisingly short. Some delegates argued that without rotation in office, Congress would become a permanent aristocracy, leaders who served for life, disconnected from the people that they were meant to represent. But others pushed back. They believed experience in government was an asset, not a problem, that a seasoned legislator was more valuable than a rotating cast of amateurs, and above all, they trusted the election itself to be the check. If voters wanted someone gone, they could remove them. So the Constitution was ratified without term limits for Congress. It seemed reasonable in 1787. What they could not have predicted was what American politics would look like 200 years later. Within decades, a pattern began to emerge. Politicians who won once tended to win again and again. The longer someone served, the more influence they accumulated. Committee positions, donor relationships, name recognition, the machinery of re-election began to feed itself. By the late 1800s, Congress had members who had been serving since before the Civil War, not because voters loved them unconditionally, but because incumbency had quietly become one of the most powerful forces in American democracy, a force the founders never named, never limited, and never fully anticipated. This absence of a decision planted a seed, and over the next 2 centuries, that seed grew into something that now shapes every law, every election, and every political frustration Americans feel today. Imagine your town had a mayor. He was elected in 1950. He's still mayor today, not because he's done anything remarkable, but because he's been there so long that nobody remembers what it was like before him, and nobody with real talent wants to run against someone with that much built-up power. That is essentially what happened to large portions of the United States Congress across the 20th century. Carl Vinson of Georgia served in the House for 50 years, from 1914 to 1965. Emanuel of New York served for 49 years. These men shaped American policy across multiple wars, multiple presidents, multiple generations of American life, without ever facing a meaningful electoral challenge. And here's where it gets structural. In Congress, seniority determines power. The longer you serve, the more important committees you chair. The more committees you chair, the more you control what legislation gets written, what gets voted on, and what gets buried. This created a self-reinforcing system. Serving longer meant becoming more powerful. Becoming more powerful meant raising more money. Raising more money meant winning more easily. Winning more easily meant serving even longer. The founders' belief that elections would keep this in check was being quietly disproven, not through corruption or conspiracy, but through the simple mechanics of how power accumulates over time. By the 1940s, Americans had finally seen what unlimited tenure could look like at the very top, and it scared them. Franklin Roosevelt was the most powerful president in American history. He led the country through the Great Depression and World War II. He was beloved by millions. But when he ran for a third term in 1940 and then a fourth in 1944, a question began to circulate that made even his supporters uncomfortable. Is any one person supposed to hold this much power for this long? Roosevelt died in office in 1945, and in 1951, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment, limiting future presidents to 2 terms. Americans had decided that no president should serve indefinitely. But here is the detail that gets lost in history textbooks. That same Congress that imposed term limits on the presidency refused to impose them on itself. The branch of government that wrote the rule exempted itself from it. Senators and representatives remained unlimited. The fix applied to everyone except the people who voted for the fix. That asymmetry, a restrained executive and an unchecked legislature, is the foundation of everything that came next. By the early 1990s, Americans had reached a breaking point. Congress had approval ratings in the low 20s. A recession had made voters feel that Washington was completely disconnected from their lives. And then something remarkable happened. Across the country, citizens began bypassing Congress entirely and taking the question of term limits directly to their state ballots. By 1995, 23 states had passed laws imposing term limits on their members of Congress. The message from voters was unambiguous. If Washington won't limit itself, we will do it for them. But in May 1995, the Supreme Court struck it all down. In U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton, the court ruled 5-4 that states did not have the constitutional authority to impose term limits on federal representatives. Only a constitutional amendment, requiring 2/3 of Congress to agree, could do that. In other words, the only people who could impose term limits on Congress were the members of Congress themselves. The people most benefiting from the system were the only ones with the power to change it. The revolt of 1995 failed, but the frustration that drove it never went away. Today, the numbers are stark. The average House member has served over 8 years, the average senator over 11. Several current members have served for more than 3 decades. And every 2 years, Americans go to the ballot box and ask themselves why nothing ever seems to change. Right now, in 2025, term limits are back in the national conversation. And this time, the frustration is bipartisan in a way it rarely has been before. Polling consistently shows that roughly 3 in 4 Americans, across party lines, support some form of congressional term limits. It is one of the few political questions where a conservative voter in Alabama and a progressive voter in Vermont tend to give the same answer. For younger Americans, the frustration is existential. They are inheriting a political system shaped largely by decisions made before they were born, by people who have been in power longer than they've been alive. The feeling isn't just political, it's personal. For older Americans, the frustration is different but equally real. They remember when Congress felt more responsive, more connected, more willing to compromise. The sense of loss is about what democracy was supposed to feel like, and what it actually feels like now. Do you think Congress should have term limits? Drop a yes or no in the comments right now. Here's the honest truth. The argument for keeping experienced legislators is not nothing. Governance is genuinely complex. Building relationships across the aisle, understanding the mechanics of legislation, knowing which bureaucrats to call, these things take years to learn. Rotation in office could mean a Congress perpetually full of amateurs being outmaneuvered by lobbyists who never leave. That's the case for experience. And it's real. But the case against unlimited tenure is also real. When a senator has served for 35 years, their primary loyalty, whether they intend it or not, shifts. It shifts toward the donors who funded 17 election cycles, toward the colleagues they've built relationships with for decades, toward the institutions they've helped shape. The constituents back home become more of an abstraction. And then there's the question of accountability. A politician who knows they are leaving in 4 years is more willing to take political risks, to support unpopular but necessary legislation, to vote their conscience rather than their survival instinct. A politician who plans to serve for 30 more years is playing a very different game. What happened in Philadelphia in 1787 was not a failure of wisdom. The founders were extraordinarily thoughtful men grappling with a genuinely hard problem. They made a choice, or declined to make one, and they trusted future generations to course correct if something went wrong. What they could not have anticipated was a political economy where incumbency itself becomes a kind of currency, where the act of staying in power generates the resources needed to keep staying in power, where the election, the very mechanism they trusted to be the check, becomes the thing that entrenches the problem rather than solving it. Career politicians are not a glitch in the American system. They are a feature, the logical, predictable output of choices made in a sweltering room 2 centuries ago, compounded by every decade since. Understanding that history doesn't tell you whether term limits are right or wrong, but it tells you something more important: why this question keeps coming back. Why every generation of Americans eventually arrives at the same wall and asks the same question. Should the people who benefit from the system be the ones who decide whether to change it?